Bonjour, je m'appelle Noma Dinesh, and today I will be talking about the French national holiday, the Bastille Day. Bastille Day is the common name given in English-speaking countries to the National Day of France. In France and its overseas départements and territories, it is a holiday marking the anniversary of the fall on July 14. In French, it is formally called Fête nationale française and legally le 14 juillet. Originally built as a medieval fortress, the Bastille eventually came to be used as a state prison. Political prisoners were often held there, as were citizens detained by the authorities for trial. Some prisoners were held on the direct order of the king, from which there was no appeal. Although, by the late 18th century, it was little used and was scheduled to be demolished. The Bastille had come to symbolize the harsh rule of the Bourbon monarchy. History. In 1789, tensions rose in France between reformist and conservative factions as the country struggled to resolve an economic crisis. In May, the Estates General Legislative Assembly was revived, but members of the Third Estate broke ranks, declaring themselves to be the National Assembly of the country. And on 20th June, they vowed to write a constitution for the kingdom. Who belonged to the Third Estate? Farmers, business people, merchants, professionals like lawyers and doctors all belonged to the Third Estate. The Third Estate was the only estate that paid taxes. On 11 July, Jacques Necker, the finance minister, was dismissed by Louis XVI, the last king of France, as he was sympathetic to the Third Estate, provoking an angry reaction among Parisians. Crowds formed, fearful of an attack by the royal army or by foreign regiments of mercenaries in the king's service. During the unrest of 1789, on July 14, one crowd besieged the Hôtel des Invalides for firearms, muskets, and cannons stored in its cellars. That same day, another crowd stormed the Bastille, as mentioned earlier, a fortress prison in Paris that had historically held people jailed on the basis of lettres de cachet, arbitrary royal indictments that could not be appealed and did not indicate the reason for the imprisonment, and was believed to hold a cache of ammunition and gunpowder. As it happened, at the time of the attack, the Bastille only held 7 inmates, none of great political significance. The taking of the Bastille signaled the beginning of the French Revolution, and it thus became a symbol of the end of the ancient regime. The crowd was eventually reinforced by the mutinous Régiment des Rats Français, whose usual role was to protect public buildings. Governor de Launay, the commander of the Bastille, capitulated and opened the gates to avoid a mutual massacre. According to the official documents, about 200 attackers and just one defender died before the capitulation. However, possibly because of a misunderstanding, fighting resumed. In this second round of fighting, de Launay and 7 other defenders were killed. As for Jacques de Flesselles, the Prévôt des Marchands, the elected head of the city's guilds, who under the feudal monarchy also had the competences of a present-day mayor. Now, how did the Bastille Day change France? As early as 1789, the year of the storming of the Bastille, preliminary designs for a national festival were underway. The Fête de la Fédération on 14 July 1790 was a celebration of the unity of the French nation during the French Revolution. The aim of the celebration, 1 year after the storming of the Bastille, was to symbolize peace. The event took place on the Champ de Mars, which was located far outside of Paris at the time. The work needed to transform the Champ de Mars into a suitable location for the celebration was not on schedule to be completed in time. On the day recalled as the Journée des Brutes, thousands of Parisian citizens gathered together to finish the construction needed for the celebration. The day of the festival, the National Guard assembled and proceeded along the Boulevard du Temple in the pouring rain, and were met by an estimated 260,000 Parisian citizens at the Champ de Mars. A mass was celebrated by Talleyrand, Bishop of Autun. The popular General Lafayette, as captain of the National Guard of Paris and a confidant of the king, took his oath to the Constitution, followed by King Louis XVI. After the end of the official celebration, the day ended in a huge 4-day popular feast, and people celebrated with fireworks as well as fine wine and running nude through the streets in order to display their great freedom. As mentioned earlier, the incident of the storming of the Bastille was a major cause for the escalation of the French Revolution. The French Revolution had a major impact on European and Western history by ending feudalism and creating the path for the future advances in broadly defined individual freedoms. Its impact on French nationalism was profound, while also stimulating nationalist movements throughout Europe. Modern historians argue the concept of the nation-state was a direct consequence of the revolution. It inspired campaigns for the abolition of slavery and universal suffrage. The values and institutions it created dominate French politics to this day. It paved the way for the French Constitution. The Constitution of 1791 was created by the National Assembly during the French Revolution. It established the Kingdom of French, and its content was revolutionary. It retained the monarchy, but sovereignty effectively resided in the Legislative Assembly, which was elected by a system of indirect voting. The franchise was restricted to active citizens who paid a minimal sum in taxes. About 2/3 of adult men had the right to vote. Though the constitution lasted less than a year, it paved the way for the current constitution. It presented the ideologies of liberty, equality, and fraternity to all. France becomes a constitutional monarchy, later completely abolishing monarchy to become a republic. The National Assembly completed the draft of the constitution in 1791. Its main object was to limit the powers of the monarch. These powers, instead of being concentrated in the hands of one person, were now separated and assigned to different institutions: the legislature, executive, and judiciary. This made France a constitutional monarchy. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Although Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. Rulers of other neighboring countries too were worried by the developments in France and made plans to send troops to put down the events that had been taking place. After a lot of events and changes brought about by the Jacobins, a newly elected assembly came into play. The newly elected assembly was called the Convention. On 21st September 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. As you know, a republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including the head of the government. There is no hereditary monarchy. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. On 21st January 1793, he was executed publicly at the Place de la Concorde. The Queen Marie Antoinette met with the same fate shortly after. Empowered women. Women had no political rights in pre-revolutionary France. They could not vote or hold any political office. They were considered passive citizens, forced to rely on men to determine what was best for them in the government. It was the men who defined these categories, and women were forced to accept male domination in the political sphere. Women were taught to be committed to their husbands. A woman's education often consisted of learning to be a good wife and mother. Thus, women were not supposed to be involved in the political sphere, as the limit of their influence was the raising of future citizens. Conditions of women before the French Revolution. Women were considered socially inferior to men. There was no access to education except for the women from the first and second estates. Small jobs such as selling fruits, flowers, etc. were assigned to women from third estates. Conditions of women after the French Revolution. Efforts were made to improve the conditions of women, like laws were made related to marriage, divorce was legalized, schools were set up, schooling was made compulsory for girls, and the right to vote was given after 1946. This is how the Bastille Day influenced France the way it is today. The storming of the Bastille marked the start of the French Revolution. It was the beginning of the end for the monarchy. It represented a call for liberty, equality, and a more democratic form of government. Today, the holiday is an opportunity to celebrate French unity and the French way of life. The Bastille Day military parade is the largest of its kind, with thousands of participants and millions of viewers. July 14 can mean many things to many people, but for French people around the globe, it is a day to celebrate their country. Merci.